When sin and its consequences are discussed, whether it's Old Testament, New Testament alike, but for our purposes specifically with regard to the New Testament, it's often discussed in the context of the fall of man from Genesis 3. Now, you know that account very well, and so there's not really any reason for the purposes of this lesson to go back and rehash that information. But when Adam and Eve partook of the forbidden fruit and fell in the Garden of Eden, and while we know that account, we're familiar with it, we understand the consequences that they directly had to suffer, sometimes we're not always as familiar with the long-lasting repercussions of their actions. Now, we are not guilty of the sin of Adam and Eve. That's Calvinism. It's false. I'm not going to be held accountable for the sins of those two people thousands of years ago, and neither are you. But even though their sin, their guilt is not transmitted down the line, as some people do teach, the consequences of their actions have been felt and will continue to be felt down through the ages because of the specific circumstances that developed in that time and shortly thereafter. And I think that's really what Paul was getting at in Romans 5 and verse 12, where he wrote, "Wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, not because we're guilty of their sin, but because all have sinned." Sin's entrance left obvious impacts on Adam and Eve directly. That's quite obvious from their dismissal from the garden, the immediate consequences they had to suffer, and other things of such nature. But the impact that was felt on humanity likewise cannot be denied either. And if we are going to avoid the devastation that's left by the path of sin, we must understand that path so that we can effectively defeat it. If you were to engage in some sort of athletic contest and you were given the opportunity to know ahead of time what your opponent's plan in engaging you in that contest was going to be, would you find that beneficial or not? Well, obviously we would find it beneficial. Somebody might argue the ethics behind it, and that's another discussion altogether. But as far as the ability to enter into that contest and be successful in it, would it be helpful to you to know ahead of time what your opponent is planning to do? Absolutely. It pays to know what your enemy, your competitor, is doing or is going to do. And friends, we have no greater enemy than Satan. We have no greater adversary. Would it not behoove us to come to some conclusion as to exactly the manner that he approaches us and lays before us that path of sin so that we can effectively divert ourselves from it? That's exactly what we want to talk about briefly tonight in looking at the path of sin, which, number one, and I think this is so vital because this is one area that sometimes we feel is just so innocent. We're not necessarily guilty of sin just because of this aspect, even though it can lead us in that direction, but because we're not going to be held accountable per se for this first thing we're going to talk about, sometimes we have it in our minds, well, it's just innocent. And friends, it's not innocent. It's devastating if we allow it to go unchecked. And that is that the path of sin first includes and begins with temptation. The word tempt or temptation means to induce, to entice, to attract. It doesn't actually mean to indulge in it yet, but it does mean that we recognize the potential pleasure inherent in whatever it is, whether it's something we do, whether it's something we partake of, whether it's something we're looking at, whatever. It means that we see the potential pleasure in it. And so therefore we're tempted to indulge in whatever it is. Now, where does temptation come from? Well, James 1:13 clearly tells us it doesn't come from God. He said there, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. God does not tempt us. Though, yes, He allows us of our own free moral agency to be tempted, He does not Himself tempt us. Think about the book of Job. Did God in any form or fashion tempt Job himself in that book? Absolutely not. But He did allow him to be tempted. Well, He does the same for us. He allows us to be tempted because we're not robots. We're not pre-programmed to act in some way. We're free to choose what we're going to do, what path we're going to trod. But temptation itself does not come from God. What we do find the Bible revealing to us in 1 Corinthians 7 is that temptation comes from Satan and those who follow after him. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 5, defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. And now that's a specific occasion. I understand the context of 1 Corinthians 7, but the principle applies generally speaking. Satan is the origin of temptation. He's the one who's the adversary of our souls. He's the one who wants us to be lost, and therefore He is the one who is going to insert the stumbling block before us to trip us up. And that is exactly why he does what he does. Satan wants us to be lost. He wants us to go to hell. Now, to say that sends shivers down my spine. The idea of someone, something, who wants someone else to be lost. To be sent to such a horrible place as hell is going to be, but that's exactly what he wants. He wants every soul under heaven to be there with him. And in addition to wanting us to be lost, he knows that we must submit to sin in order for his plan to succeed. We're not going to be lost pursuing the paths of righteousness, but he does know that we will be lost if we pursue the path of sin. And so he tempts us. He cast those trials and those things before us that he knows could be personally troubling to us, so that we might have an occasion to fall just as he so desires. And he uses the world to accomplish his purpose. You remember the plea of John in 1 John 2? Verse 15, he said to love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. But then in verse 16, he said, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father. What does that mean then? Well, it's sin. If it's not of the Father, it's sin. But in what way do we come in contact with those things? He said not only is it not of the Father, but it is of the world, Satan's method of casting that stumbling block before us. But how is it that we can overcome temptation? You see, we cannot avoid temptation. It's going to hit every one of us, whether we want it or not, and we certainly don't want it. But because we can't avoid it, how can we overcome it? Well, James said in James 4 and verse 7, submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. The more we grow in our relationship with God, it's not necessarily the case that Satan is going to quit attacking us and quit tempting us altogether, but he is going to become less and less effective in his temptations and in the trials that he casts before us. Now, temptation often brings feelings of guilt. It should. If it doesn't, then that means we have not properly educated and disciplined our conscience. And so the vast majority of us, temptation is going to bring feelings of guilt because we have felt tempted. But it's those feelings of guilt that are going to motivate us to withstand. And we must rest in comfort of the fact, though, that temptation alone does not mean that we have sinned. And that's why I said at the beginning of this is one area that people feel is the most innocent. Because temptation itself is not sin. How do we know that? Well, because in Matthew 4, Jesus was tempted. Was Jesus guilty of sin in Matthew 4 because He was tempted? Absolutely not. Why? Because temptation itself inherently is not sinful. It's not until that temptation is yielded to, James 1, 14 and following, that sin is actually committed. But if we allow that temptation to go unchecked, we view it as being nothing more than innocent. That's when the trouble can begin to set in, because the path of sin may begin with temptation, but it continues with initiation. Go back to James 1 and begin back in verse 15. James continues laying out that line of reasoning he began in verse 13. To let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And then verse 15, when lust hath conceived, that's when it brings forth sin. And sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. The word lust is simply another word for temptation. That's the idea behind James 1:15, is that when a person is tempted, when they lust, when that lust or that temptation conceives in indulgence, then sin has occurred. And going back to the beginning, Genesis 3, Satan came to Eve and said, "What has God told you about this tree in the midst of the garden?" She said, "Well, He told us that thou shalt not touch it, thou shalt not look at it, thou shalt not eat of it, lest ye shall surely die." Satan rebutted and said, "Well, you're not going to die. You shall not surely die. But He doth know that in the day that ye eat of it, ye shall become as gods, knowing good from evil." Was that appealing to Eve? Yeah, it was. It was appealing to her to have a higher source of knowledge. It was appealing to her to be exalted in that sense above anyone else who would eventually come. Of course, at the time it was just her and Adam. But it would exalt them above any others that would ultimately come later, because they would be as gods while others would be nothing more than mere man. That exaltation, that authority, that power was tempting to her. Can't say that I blame her. We often become starry-eyed over certain aspects of our life that could bring similar glory to us. That was just her particular brand of it. I'm not saying it was right, but I'm also saying that that's not something that's uncommon to mankind as a whole, even to us at times. And so she was tempted. It was appealing to her. But was the appeal of that statement by Satan alone enough for her to have sinned? No. At what point did she sin? Verse 6. When she took of that fruit and ate it, and then gave to Adam, and he too ate of it. You see, up to that point it had just been lust, it had just been temptation, but in Genesis 3:6, lust hath conceived and brought forth sin. Joshua chapters 6 and 7, Israel had crossed over the Jordan, had entered into Canaan finally, after over 40 years since they had first come out of Egypt. Joshua finally leads them across the Jordan River. They begin preparation to invade the land, to drive out the heathen, and to inhabit it themselves. The first obstacle they came up against was a city named Jericho. And when God commanded Israel to go into Jericho and to take it first, set that up kind of as a base for further action, God had been very, very specific with the leadership and the leadership with the people as to what they were to do and what they were not to do when they went into Jericho. They were to go in and destroy everything and everybody. They were not to take anything, regardless of what it was, regardless of how valuable it might have been, regardless of how useful they might have viewed it. They were to destroy everything and everyone and take nothing. Very simple. Well, in Joshua 7, we find ourselves introduced to a man who knew of that commandment. Everybody did. God had been very specific with the people. This is what I want and this is what I don't want. Jericho, though, was a magnificent city. And I imagine that when they entered into that city, they saw the spoils of that city and it was incredibly enticing to them. And to see all of the idolatrous instruments, the particular items used to worship their idols, to see all of the money, to see all of the other material goods present in that city, it had to be incredibly enticing to them to see all of that, to how valuable it was and how useful it could have been in their lives. Was there anything wrong with them looking at that and seeing the potential in it? No, not necessarily. There wasn't anything wrong with them seeing something in the course of that city and saying, well, that sure does look nice. I wouldn't mind having that. That itself would have not been inherently sinful, as long as they did not take of it. They would be abiding by their command. Now, yes, I understand the discussion of towing the line, of the slippery slope and all that, and I agree with all that, but as far as actually committing sin, that would not occur as per God's command until they actually took of it. Joshua 7, though, we're introduced to that man named Achan. And in verse 1, the verse says that specifically Achan committed trespass. Why? Not just because he looked at it, not just because he saw the potential pleasure or usefulness in whatever he looked at. No, Achan committed a trespass because he took of the accursed thing. He lusted. But in Achan's life, that lust conceived and brought forth sin. The result was, when they later in that chapter 7 went to the next city that they were to conquer, Ai, sent a very small contingent of soldiers, believing that they could easily take it, but they were routed, absolutely destroyed by that small city. Why? Because they had sinned and they didn't have God on their side. You see, that path of sin, it began with the temptation. But the temptation alone was not enough to constitute sin, but what did constitute sin was when that temptation initiated itself in the actual action, in the trespass itself. And in that way, sin truly is the fruit of initiating the abundance of the heart. Matthew 12:34, Jesus said, O generation of vipers, how can ye, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaketh. Well, just as true as out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks, out of the abundance of the heart, so do we act. We saw the heart of Achan in Joshua 7. We saw the heart of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. Likewise, we saw the heart of Jesus in Matthew 4. And how they were all similarly tempted, and yet how they responded differently to that temptation. Adam and Eve and Achan yielding to it, and yet Jesus overcoming it. Sin, though, always has its consequences. Consequences are always negative. And so, ultimately, when that path of sin leads through temptation, that temptation initiates itself in sin. Finally, we see that the path of sin results in devastation. The problem most people face in life, in decision making, generally speaking, is that they don't see and remember the pain past the pleasure. They do not see the pain past the pleasure. Now, what I mean by that is, sin, yes, can have momentary pleasure. Look at Hebrews 11 verse 25, and you remember that the Hebrews writer there addresses Moses and talks about how that by faith Moses, when he came to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Yes, sin can be pleasurable. If it was not at least temporarily pleasurable, no one would want to do it. It wouldn't be tempting. That's the whole concept behind temptation. It's something that offers pleasure. The problem with sin and the problem we face in making decisions about sin is that we can't see the pain past the pleasure. The pleasure is temporary. It is fleeting. It is but for a moment. The pain can be eternal. When it comes to making decisions regarding sin, we have to be able to see the pain past the pleasure. And the Bible clearly reveals to us what that pain is going to consist of. That pain consists of our being separated from God, Isaiah 59. It consists of us being enslaved and in bondage to it, Romans 1, 21 through 32. The pain of sin consists of ultimately it finding us out. Whether it be in this life or in the next, it's going to find us out. Numbers 32, 23. The pain of sin consists of us not prospering as we can to our fullest potential. Proverbs 28 and verse 13. The pain of sin is that it weakens us. 1 Corinthians 3, 1 through 3. The pain of sin is that it brings reproach on us, on our families, on our loved ones. Proverbs 14:34. The pain of sin is that it ultimately brings death. Romans 6:23. And promises everlasting destruction as a surety. 2 Thessalonians 1, 7 through 9. There is no other end result of sin. That's it. That's all it has to offer. That's the total package that it has lying before us. Separation from God, bondage, finding us out, keeping us from prospering, weakening us, bringing reproach, bringing death, and ultimately condemning our souls. Now, how does that sound? That's the pain past the pleasure. Are you willing to risk your soul over it? Satan wants to paint the rosiest picture that he possibly can about sin. He wants us to believe that sin is going to make us happy. It's going to make us more attractive. It's going to make us more successful. It's going to provide us greater abundance. It's like some of the commercials you see on television that always paint their product in the rosiest picture possible. I think of alcohol commercials where the commercial will always take a very attractive man or a very attractive woman, They'll be the ones partaking of it. They'll be laughing, having a great time. But you never see the camera panning over and capturing the person who's given their life to that vile concoction, sitting alone, desolate, poor in the gutter. You never see them representing what ultimately that product can do, and that's how Satan approaches us with this neat little package of sin. He doesn't want you to know the pain past the pleasure. He just wants you to see the present, the pleasure, what you can get in here and now. Friends, that path keeps on traveling through that pleasure. It arrives at the pain. Why would you want to endure that? You don't have to. That's the great thing about it. Now, even though we may all be guilty of sin, we do not have to suffer its consequences. We can overcome it. Not because of any inherent power that we have, but because we serve an all-powerful God. If you want to be made free from your sin tonight, by becoming a Christian, you can. Believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, repenting of your sin, confessing your faith, being immersed in water, God will remove you from this path of sin. You'll be set on a path of righteousness leading to heaven. Maybe you were traveling that pathway at one time because of your obedience to the gospel. But since that time you've exited. You've begun traveling a different pathway. You've gone back to the path of sin, but now you know where it's leading you and you don't want to get there. That's not the destination at which you ultimately want to arrive. You want to go back to serving God. Why not come back tonight? Repenting of your sin, confessing it, praying unto God for forgiveness. God will do everything for you that you need Him to do. You've got to help yourself, though. You've got to be willing to turn from that life of sin and turn back to God. If you'll do it, seek His forgiveness. He'll forgive you. Cleanse you of all of your unrighteousness and remember your sins, and your iniquities no more. Why not stop traveling this path that leads to eternal destruction? Begin traveling that straight and narrow way that leads to life. There may be few that find it, but you can be one of the few. You can be one tonight. If you have need, will you come now while together we stand and sing?